We're glad to see you this evening. Thanks for being here as we join together for Bible study. These Wednesday nights, we're looking at a series of lessons that were put together by our beloved brother Bill Hall. Major tests of our faith is the theme of the lessons. If you're looking at a study guide, we're on lesson number 10. And so we're talking about things that really challenge us, things that really make it hard to keep on keeping on. Major tests of our faith. And tonight, we're talking about the unfaithfulness of those whom we have tried to influence. Now, I've been really impressed with all the different ways that Brother Hall was able to discover that can be very discouraging. And I don't know that I would have thought of this one, but I think it's certainly appropriate. And I imagine that lots of us have had this very sort of an experience. When you encounter somebody who is excited to hear the truth, and they're just hungry for all the information that you can feed to them, and they just take it in, and they're excited, and they're learning, and they obey the gospel, and when they're first Christians, they're just on fire. And I'll tell you, that's just a thrilling thing to see that in someone that you have had a personal hand in influencing and teaching. It's very encouraging. We're not saying we do that for our own glory at all, nothing for personal vain glory, but just to know that you've had a chance to be a part of influencing someone to obey the gospel of Christ. That's just exciting. But as time wears on, sometimes those people lose that fire and even fall away and quit altogether. And that, on the flip side, that is one of the most discouraging things that we'll ever experience. It's just hard to see that happen. And it's a devastating thing to recognize a situation like that. Someone who had so much potential and everything was looking so good, and then for some reason or another they have fallen away. And so that's the idea that we want to explore for our class study this evening. The challenge, the test, the discouragement to our own faith that results when somebody that we've been trying to influence loses their faith. So that's the idea of this. Let's start out by looking at 3 John, the short book of 3 John. Only one chapter, of course, verse 4. The Apostle John says, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." I think almost all commentators believe that the children that he's talking about there are not his literal physical descendants, but rather those that he had nurtured in the faith, those that he had taught, and they came to be believers and obedient believers. And John said, no greater joy. He had no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. I'll tell you, that's pretty impressive when you think about it. The Apostle John had experienced all kinds of amazing things. And for him to say, there's no greater joy that I know than to know that those that I have taught and influenced in the faith of Jesus Christ are walking true to the faith. And so that's an impressive thing. Again, I know that many of you have had that experience, and it may have been. I gotta tell you, even if it's our own children, and all of us are parents, and our children have obeyed the gospel, there's no greater joy than our physical children obeying the gospel. And then take that a step further. If you've had a chance to teach and influence somebody and see them take the seed and it grows and they obey the gospel and mature as Christians, that's just a wonderful thing. I mean, it's almost hard to compare anything to that. And so we know the joy that John was talking about.
Yeah, so God the Father, a lot of times the Bible talks about God being the Father, right, and us as His children, and He has that kind of joy when those that obey the gospel, he's pleased with that. Just like us as parents, we're pleased when our kids do well. And John here, those that he had influence over, he's pleased. I mean, it just really brings him joy to see, I played a part in that. I had a hand in that. Whether he was the one that actually taught them and converted them or just encouraged them along the way. In verse 2, he said that he hoped that their health prosper even as their soul is prospering.
Yeah.
And just wanting the best for them, and when they're walking in the truth, they're doing things right. I mean, that's something really to be excited about.
Yeah. And I don't think that anybody thinks badly of John here for mentioning that. I don't think John is trying to, puff himself up or pat himself on the back or anything like that. He's just expressing a genuine, heartfelt joy over seeing these people be faithful to the Lord. And so I don't think it's bad. You may think of some people through the years that you've had that positive influence on. And I don't think it's a bad thing for you to rejoice in that, to be glad about it, to thank God that you were in the position to be able to influence someone positively in that way. It's a good thing, and we can share in that kind of rejoicing. Anybody have a thought or comment on this? Yes, Wayne.
John says the same thing.
Yeah.
And 4, he says, I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth, just as we received commandments from your fathers. And he says, the elder to the chosen lady and her children, which is, I think, the church.
Yeah.
And those that are Christians.
And he was glad to know the good report. Exactly right. Yeah. Okay.
All right, number 2 wants us to go to 1 Thessalonians. So if you look at 1 Thessalonians, we'll look at chapter 3. 1 Thessalonians 3, beginning at verse 6. It says, Now when Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our affliction and distress by your faith. For now we live, if ye stand fast in the Lord. And so the question is, consider 1 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 8, which we just read. How did Paul react when Timothy brought him a good report concerning the faith of the Thessalonians? So Timothy had been sent there. If you look up in the previous verses, verse 2, Timothy had been sent there to establish them, to comfort them concerning their faith. And then he came back, he brought report in verse 6 that we read there. He brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, that you have good remembrance of us always. In verse 7, it says, we were comforted over you in all our affliction and distress by your faith. So Paul's reaction was comfort, knowing that they were doing well spiritually. And so about like John, John, it was a great thing for him to see that. Paul was comforted even though there was trouble going on. There was some comfort in that, those brethren are doing well in Thessalonica. Paul had taught them, he had lived among them, he'd spent time with them, and then he had been away from them, couldn't get there to them, and Timothy brought a report.
We think this was on the second missionary journey. He left Timothy and Silas behind. He went on to Athens and then on to Corinth, and he was all the way to Corinth before Timothy and Silas caught up with him. And all along the way, and at this juncture, before Timothy got there with that report, he was probably a man alone. We think this was probably that time frame where he was working with Aquila and Priscilla making tents in Corinth. And so, and we know that the Lord even had to appear to Paul, an angel of the Lord, in a vision to say, don't fear, nobody's going to hurt you. That was at Corinth. And so Paul was under a pretty heavy load of stress. He was being persecuted. And so in the context of some severe trials of persecution, when a good report came to him about these brethren in Thessalonica, he said, we were comforted over you in all our affliction and distress by your faith. So he talks about the affliction and distress that he was under, but just hearing the good report about them gave him comfort. And then that expression in verse 8, we live if ye stand fast. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So we're
He really was.
maintaining because you're
He
doing
was really invested in those people. Their spiritual well-being was absolutely vitally important to him.
Yeah, I think you're right. Personally invested because he had spent time with them and been there among them. He knew those people well. It wasn't like, and you know, he should wish any Christians well, even if he hadn't met them. But he personally knew these folks, and so when he heard they were doing good, it obviously brought him some sense of calm and comfort.
Yeah.
There's a follow-up question there too. It says concerning this, how do you think he would have reacted had he been told that they had left the faith? So he's comforted because he'd been told that they were standing strong. How would his reaction have been if they left the faith?
You have to believe he would have been
That'd been
devastated.
kicking him while he was down because
Yeah.
he was already in a bad spot with the afflictions that you described he was talking about. And then if they had left the faith, oh man, it's just trouble on top of trouble.
Yeah, exactly right. Anybody have a thought, Caleb?
It's interesting to me in finance we have this risk-reward trade-off, and when it comes to sharing the gospel with someone, there's this idea of risk and reward, especially when it comes to personally knowing someone. And so I think about you're risking your own pride in a sense.
Sort of putting yourself out there.
Put yourself out there, which can be difficult to do, but the reward we see here you can be lifted up so much more by taking that risk. You take more risk, you have more opportunity, and obviously that's not what it's about. It's not about feeling good, but that's a consequence. It is. It's this idea of it's better to risk the creation of a relationship with the hope of it turning out really, really well than to never risk it at all. Which is really what God did when He created the world. He knew there's a chance that we could turn away from Him and never follow Him. But the reward He gets from when we follow Him just fills Him with so much joy. It brings Him so much pleasure when we're serving Him properly. And we just got to keep that in mind when we go to talk to people about that. The reward that we can get in a sense. Obviously, that's not what it's about. But that pleasure we feel from sharing the gospel with someone and them following in those footsteps can be great.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's not the reason we do it. In other words, we're not trying to reach people with the gospel. We're not talking to friends, neighbors, co-workers, relatives. We're not talking to them because we're looking for the good feeling. But the good feeling is a side consequence of that, and it's a good thing. And we want to experience that because it's a byproduct of what's really important. That is, they've obeyed the gospel.
Well, in 2 Corinthians 11:28, where Paul, he talked about all those things that he endured, but he mentioned, besides the things that were without, the care of the churches that come upon him daily. So Paul's situation was different from ours, but he stayed awake at night, worrying about the churches. And so, to be constantly worried about how the brethren were doing, the places he had been, and to hear this good report from Thessalonica, I mean, that's a good thing. Well, I feel good about that one. Now, we may have some other places to worry about, and we still got to worry about them, but that's a good thing, knowing that they're standing strong.
Yeah, and we've said lots of times, Philippi and Thessalonica, two great churches, and the fact that he kept getting good reports from Thessalonica was a big boost to him, even while he was under pretty severe hardships elsewhere. Anybody else? All right, let's look at 2 Corinthians 2. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 4. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 4, "For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote unto you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that ye might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you." Now, we think here that Paul is referring to the letter we call 1 Corinthians. We've often mentioned that in 1 Corinthians, he just dealt with a litany of issues that existed in the church at Corinth. And he had to have some hard words for them. He had to rebuke them pretty sternly. There was a lot going wrong at Corinth. We just talked about Thessalonica was doing great. Corinth was not doing so great. Corinth was in a lot of trouble, and he wrote to them and really lined them out on several things. But notice he said that it was out of much affliction and anguish of heart that he wrote. He had many tears as he was dealing with that, as he was writing, as he was dealing with the issues that existed at Corinth. He said he wanted them to know the love which I have more abundantly to you. He did that because he loved them. There's probably a lot of points we could make about this. One of the things is that if you really love somebody, you just look the other way. If you really love somebody, you just sweep the issues under the rug and don't deal with them. No, that's not right. Paul loved them and wrote to them with anguish of heart and many tears because he did love them and he wouldn't look the other way because their eternal souls were at stake. But here's sort of the opposite of Thessalonica that we were just talking about. Here in Corinth, you had the situation of a church. Again, Paul had worked among them. He had been instrumental in establishing the church in Corinth. And so it was a heartache to him to know that they were not doing well. And so that's what our lesson is primarily about. Situations wherein people that we have had a hand in influencing turn out not doing so well. And sort of the hardship, the heartache that brings when that situation exists. And again, I'm sad to say that probably most of us have had that sort of experience. It may have been someone, just an anonymous person that you shared the gospel with, and they obeyed the gospel. Maybe even more likely, it was somebody close to us, maybe a family member, maybe a child, maybe a sibling, maybe some other relatives. But we have known that kind of heartache that Paul is describing there when he talks about anguish of heart and many tears. It's a hard thing, and that's really what our lesson is designed to key in on. What do you do in situations like that? Any thoughts there? Anybody? Wayne?
Yeah, in chapter 7 of the same book, at verses 8 and 9, talking about the same incident, he says, "For though I caused you sorrow on my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I see that letter caused you sorrow, though only for a while. I now rejoice, not that you were made sorrowful, but that you were made sorrowful to the point of repentance. For you were made sorrowful according to the will of God, in order that you might not suffer loss in anything."
Yeah. So he did what had to be done, and it turned out well. They had repented, and so that's sort of a positive thing for us to latch onto. It's never pleasant, absolutely never pleasant to have to deal with situations where people are not faithfully doing the will of God. It has to be done. Love demands that we do that. But man, the rejoicing that can result if it works and they repent.
Most of the time it doesn't work.
Unfortunately, too many times it doesn't work, but when it does, it's a good thing. But, whether it does or not,
It's still the will of God.
it's the will of God. Exactly right.
Yeah. So church at Corinth had a ton of issues, and Paul, like you said, Paul lined them out. He let them know that they were off base in a lot of different ways. And I think the tendency of people is to say, I bet Paul was just smiling as he was writing that letter. He was
loving
so
this.
happy, loving every minute of it. You guys are not doing this right and not doing this right. I bet he loved. And what he was telling them is that I did that. It's not something that we just are eager to do, but we've got to do it because I love you. I want you to do right. And that's tough personally, if we deal with that personally, and somebody comes to you, our thought may be, I bet they loved every minute of that, telling me how wrong I am. But really, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of love on their part to come to me and talk to me about something that I've got going on.
Yeah.
And so I ought to receive it that way. It took a lot for them, and I ought to take a step back and reevaluate.
I have personally been accused, and I'm sure many of you have been, of being hateful when we try to rebuke someone who's in sin. That's unloving. It's actually not. It would be so much easier to just turn and go the other way, to sweep it under the rug and ignore it. But as Paul did with the Corinthians, love demanded that he address that. And that would be the same for us.
Right. Yeah, and we can use judgment on how we approach things, but yeah, you're right. It'd be unloving to not say anything because then we're leaving somebody maybe in a lost condition.
I'm going to tell you, no one enjoys dealing with those kind of things, but it's necessary.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, let's go on.
All right, number 4. So open-ended question. Number 4, it says, a Christian hurts most when his own children turn their backs on the Lord. Discuss some reasons why this is an especially severe trial to one's faith. So I'm sure maybe get a lot of comments on this one, but I just think that the first thing that I wrote down was, I think we have to remember that people are free moral agents. God made us that way. And I think sometimes we try to put blame on ourselves for decisions that other people make, you know. And so I think maybe that's one of the issues why, if that happens, obviously I haven't dealt with that. My children are young. But if one of my children grow up and they fall away, then first off, right now I need to be busy trying to teach them the right way. I've got a small window of opportunity to get things right. But if they fall away, I've got to know that they've got decisions to make on their own, and I can't put all the blame on me for every decision that my children make. They were free moral agents, right?
Yeah.
But I know there's going to be a lot of comments here.
Anybody have a thought? Wait.
So, the class I've been teaching on Sunday mornings on the divided kingdom. And, you know, occasionally you find a good king. But then that good king, guess what happens to his sons?
Bad sons.
They're terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible sons.
Hezekiah and Manasseh just stand out as a classic example. He was so good, Manasseh was horrible.
So, you know, I was thinking about that Sunday. I thought, you know what? How do these kings, they're labeled as good kings, but they were terrible fathers. I mean, they had to have been awful fathers because, you know, their mother must have done the training. The father didn't do anything in the training. And that just shows how, well, just like you were saying, we only have a certain amount of time to do this. And once we lose that window, it's gone.
Yeah.
We can't do anything about it. It's gone. And then we look back and we try to go, well, I wish I'd have done that. Well, I wish I'd have done that. Well, I wish I'd have done that. But when people were trying to tell you when your kids were growing up, you had no time for it.
Yeah.
You want to listen at all.
Yeah.
Well, and nobody's perfect, so, you know, there's no parent that's going to do things, you know, there's things I think about, I probably messed up there, I probably could have done that different, you know, so we're always going to be able to look back and say, well, I could have done things differently, especially if, you know, if the result isn't what I think it ought to be. You know, the Proverbs 22 verse 6 is the proverbial truth, to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. You know, so we do our best. We do our best to lay a foundation. We do our best to teach them what to do, but at the end of the day, children are going to grow up, and sometimes, unfortunately, they make decisions to fall away.
Now, the question is, how does this trial of one's faith manifest itself? There's probably several ways that this can manifest itself, but unfortunately what happens lots of times is that parents begin to compromise because of what their children are doing. We've got a situation in our family right now where some parents who absolutely know better are totally compromised. They've rewritten their understanding of basic doctrinal truths in order to justify their kids in what they're doing. That's absolutely so their kids being unfaithful has resulted in being a major test of the parents' faith, because they have just developed this compromising mindset in order to justify what's going on in their family. We can't do that.
Well, it's that old, if I believe this, then that means, you know, my parents or my children or whatever, in this case children, you know, we're talking about, then that means for them, and really we're putting things at odds there. It's not, I mean, this is the truth, whether I believe it or not, and you know, the result for them is they need to believe the truth, not let me try to change the truth in order to sort their situation.
So I would just sort of summarize on that it is talk about a heartache. I don't think there's a greater heartache for a parent who's a Christian to see their children be unfaithful to the Lord. I think that's probably the greatest heartache in the world. And it would be a major test of your own faith, but you still got to do what's right.
Yeah.
Right. Thoughts or comments, anybody? All right. The author asks us to look at a specific example of Eli in 1 Samuel 3. And you all know this story pretty well, I think. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, that's when Samuel was just a boy, and he was serving the old judge Eli, and God called out to him in the night. 3 times he rushed into Eli. Yes, I'm here. What do you need? And Eli kept saying, I didn't call you. And then Eli finally said, Eli realized the Lord was speaking to him. And so he said, next time this happens, say, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Verse 9. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood and called out as other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, speak, for thy servant heareth. And the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle. And that day I will perform against Eli all the things that I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. Therefore I have sworn unto the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever. You talk about a hard message for this young boy Samuel to have to deliver. The next day, Eli called him. Verse 16, Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son, and he answered, here am I. And he said, what is the thing that the Lord has said to thee? I pray thee, hide it not from me. God do so to thee, and more also, if thou hide anything from me of all the things that he said unto thee. And Samuel told him every whit, and hid nothing from him. And he said, it is the Lord, let him do what seemeth him good. Now the question we're asked here is, how did Eli respond when he was informed that his family is going to be judged, harshly judged? And for all of us as parents, that's a really, that's a stunning statement there. I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. Eli was aware of what his boys were doing, and he didn't put any stop to. He could have, he should have, and he didn't. And so Eli was being held accountable for that as well. I don't know maybe the intent of the question, but I would answer the way Eli responded is in verse 18. It is the Lord, let him do what seemeth him good. Eli was willing to accept that judgment against himself, really. And so I guess I would say that Eli is accepting accountability in the matter. He accepts that, I should have and I didn't. And the Lord, this is the Lord. He's going to do what he needs to do.
Well, I was thinking this. Eli was a good man, it seemed like. He judged Israel for 40 years. He was God's spokesman. Never anything mentioned of him, doing any outward evil or sinful things. And it wasn't like his son's sins were a secret. In chapter 2, in verse 22, it says, Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto Israel, how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. He said unto them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. So he knew what they were doing, and he rebuked him. He even said something to him about it.
But apparently he didn't do enough.
Yeah, he didn't do enough to stop him, and so he hadn't even done the outward wrong. It was his sons, but he was having to pay for it. So Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli were all punished because of it.
And so I guess if I was going to answer the question directly, how did he respond? I think his answer there is an acceptance of his accountability in the matter. So what about us as parents? There's an accountability, there's a clear accountability that comes to us as parents. And I think this is something that maybe even Christians who are parents don't take seriously enough. There's a harsh accountability in regards to raising our children, as Ephesians 6 verse 4 says, in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, Josh mentioned earlier a thing that we always have to factor in. Our children grow up to be free moral agents. They're going to ultimately make their own decisions to be faithful to God or not. But Josh also used that expression, window of opportunity. We got a window of opportunity. We better be using it, because that window will shut. And then we won't be able to do any more and wish that we had. And we very well could be held accountable for it.
Yeah. Kind of go back to our last question that we talked about. Eli obviously loved his sons, but evidently he didn't love them enough to not be so soft against the wrong they were doing.
He should have put a stop to it. I
Yeah.
mean, instead of just words, he should have taken action
Right.
against them.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody? Wade?
Yeah, I mean, and you're right. Our kids are free moral agents, but we still have a great influence upon our kids, depending on your relationship with your kids. You still have a great influence, and your kids, depending on your relationship, they're either going to take what you say and think about it and make a judgment based on it, or they're just going to completely ignore it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's always important. I think even if your kids get out of your house, that you maintain a relationship with them, so you can help them, guide them. 'Cause
Okay.
they still need you.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
Well,
Caleb?
and I think that's an important part too. Of course, what little I know about actual parenting, but
You can speak with all confidence now, since you're not a parent yet. You can tell, right now.
Throw it out.
well, it's already been touched on tonight a couple times, and kind of going off of what Wayne said, but that relational aspect of it is so key and so important across the board, because if it's just a iron ruling fist, and if you're just going to them, I think that's an interesting thing when you think about the God of the Old Testament. It's not just judgment, and it's not just the law. It is a God who wants a relationship with his people. It's not just the law aspect of things, just doing this and not doing this. It is this relational, I want this relationship with you. Are you showing your kids that you want a relationship with them?
Okay, good point. Good point. Anybody else? All right. So let's take the next one there, Josh. I had a little trouble with the next one.
All right, so number 6 says, can you think of others who remained faithful to the Lord after their children had brought them deep disappointment? Can you think of any Bible characters who remained faithful to God after their children deeply disappointed them? So the first thing I thought about was David. David had a lot of disappointment with some of his children. Absalom rebelled against him, sought to overthrow the kingdom. David was a man after God's own heart, but he had a lot of issues with his children. So David,
But he didn't give up. I mean,
Yeah.
and he stayed faithful to the Lord throughout.
right?
I that's the first one I put down, and then I was really
Yeah, it was
racking my
tough after
brain.
David. So I picked
Who
the easy
did
one.
anybody think of anybody else, a Bible character who experienced a situation of their children disappointing them, not being faithful?
Not the children, but the father, Jonathan. I talk about Jonathan.
He had to be disappointed with his dad.
Yeah.
But he remained true to David.
Okay, that's a good one.
What about Rebecca?
Rebecca.
Because, she had Jacob and Esau. And Esau, he's going to kill Jacob. So obviously she was very disappointed. She had to be disappointed in her son. For one
Now,
thing or another.
maybe, but I would hold her responsible for helping that situation develop.
You could be.
Kristen?
What was wrong?
David, he should have done something about Amnon when he raised his
Yeah,
daughter.
that's right. He shouldn't have put up with that. Exactly.
People aren't perfect. So.
Exactly right. Caleb?
Throw Adam out there.
Adam with Cain.
Cain,
Yeah.
and still raising Seth.
Okay. You know what? I thought of one. I really had to think hard, but I thought we were just talking about Eli and Samuel. Think about Samuel. Samuel's sons turned out to be bad guys too, and we wonder if he didn't learn bad parenting skills from Eli, maybe.
Yeah.
But in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5, 1 Samuel 8, verse 5, the people in asking for a king, they said to Samuel, "Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." We never read anything that Samuel personally had given up his faithful service to God. His children were surely a disappointment to him. But I always wondered if maybe he learned bad parenting skills from Eli. We got.
The prodigal son's dad.
That's a good one. I think that's an excellent one. The prodigal son's dad had to be really discouraged in the way that younger son had behaved himself. But he, and I think sometimes we try to draw too many between the line statements, but it appears that he was always watching for him to come home and ready to receive. He did not, this is a key point, he didn't enable him in his sinful lifestyle. You know, when his son was wishing he could eat the slop that he was feeding to the hogs, his daddy could have shelled out some money and said, you know, come on, you know, get cleaned up, get your place, get some food. He didn't bail him out while he was in this sin, but he was anxious to receive him back. Okay, I think that's a really good one, Sue.
I thought about Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. You know, that's some disappointment. I mean, that's a different situation,
Yeah.
but yeah, there was definitely some strife in that household with his sons.
Okay, we're going to run out of time here. Let's go a little bit further. What dangers does one face when he diligently tries to convert others with no success, or when those that he does convert fall away? Now, this is what we were talking about earlier. So we're talking about major tests of our faith, right? And so somebody that we know, maybe someone very close to us, maybe in our own family, a family member, a relative, maybe a friend who's very near and dear to us, a neighbor, co-worker, someone that we're really close to in one way or another, and you try to convert them, and they're just not going to. They're not going to, you know, be moved. That's a disappointment. And then, of course, he talks about the chance that maybe you did convert that guy, and then he didn't. His faith failed. He did not endure, and he fell away. Again, I don't think that any of us would be of the mindset, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. I've tried to convert other people and I haven't had success, or I converted that guy and he fell away. I'm done. I myself am not going to be a faithful Christian anymore. I don't think we're tempted like that to just quit because someone fell away or refused to obey the gospel. But I do think there's a couple of dangers. One of them is that we just draw back. I've put Caleb used the expression earlier, we put ourselves out there. You know, you kind of get out on a limb when you're trying to reach somebody. I'm not doing that anymore. I've gotten my nose mashed in too many times, and I'm not going to try anymore. Personally, I'm going to continue to be a Christian. But I am not going to try to reach other people. It's just been such a discouraging thing to me. So I think one danger is that we stop trying, and that's a mistake. And then the other danger I mentioned just a little bit ago is maybe we begin to compromise a little bit in order to water down the message, so to speak. Maybe if we just sort of compromised the message a little bit, made it a little more palatable, a little easier, maybe we could sell it. If it wasn't so hard, I'm gonna water down the message and compromise. We can't do that either.
Well, so I looked at this question totally different. You know, the thing that I keyed in on, it said with no success, and my first thought was I think we need to measure success the way that God would measure it. You know, in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6, Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Verse 7, he says, so neither then is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. You know, and I think, so we measure success as, you know, so I taught this person, I converted this person, I baptized this person. So I baptized X number of people, and that makes me a successful teacher of the gospel. When that's not measuring success. Our job is to sow the seed, and maybe somebody else comes along and does a little more. But success is sowing the seed, not just getting somebody to be baptized.
I think that's exactly right. You know, we talked about all the issues at Corinth, but Paul urged them on, even though that congregation had dealt with so many issues. 1 Corinthians 15:58, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. You have to believe that there were some faithful Christians at Corinth, even though Corinth had a lot of issues. You have to believe that there were some faithful Christians there, and Paul is saying, don't give up. Don't quit. Keep on keeping on. Always abounding in the work of the Lord. Your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And so I think probably Paul was addressing that element of the church at Corinth. His beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Caleb?
Well, just thinking back to what you were talking about giving up, about that's the easy thing to do.
right, I think that's true. Fire. Oh,
All right.
okay, go ahead.
Number 8 says, what would you say to encourage such a person? So a person who feels like they've been trying to teach people, but they haven't been successful, what encouragement would you give to them? Well, I thought about the prophet Jeremiah. You know, if you thought about prophets of old or even, anybody that's taught the gospel, you wouldn't find Jeremiah's name among those who you would list as successful at leading a bunch of people to God and converting a bunch of people. It's actually so sad to read through the book of Jeremiah. I've got 2 verses I want to read you. In Jeremiah 32 and verse 33, he says, they have turned unto me the back and not the face. Though I taught them rising up early and teaching them, yet they have not hearkened to receive instruction. He was teaching people and they just refused to listen to him. And then in Jeremiah 8 and verse 20, after many invitations that he extended to them, he says, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. So the encouragement that I would give to a person that feels like they've not been successful is, you're in pretty good company. Your job isn't, again, people are free moral agents. If it just took us to make them do it, then we could get a bunch of people together and we could go whoop people down and dunk them underwater and save them. But that's not going to work. So our job is to teach them and plead with them, but they've got to make the decision. Jeremiah, that's what he did. And unfortunately, he wasn't successful in the way that a lot of times we think we should be.
Yeah. Anybody? Real quickly, we're just out of time. Let's look at.
Greg,
Yeah.
Noah, he preached, as he built the ark, and I'm
120 years.
I'm sure that he got laughed at. I'm sure that he got, people called him crazy, and you're out of your mind, for doing this. And what is raining?
And he didn't get anybody but his own family.
His family.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. I think that's a good example. Let's look at one last passage. We're just out of time. 1 Corinthians 3. Paul actually talks about the fact that our work in this in trying to sow the seed of the kingdom and build up the kingdom of God, our work is going to be tested. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 11. For other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man build upon this foundation, gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. I think that's probably a good summary passage to the discussion we've had tonight. The foundation is Jesus Christ. We build upon that foundation, but our work is going to be tested. Your work in teaching, sharing the gospel, converting other people, raising a godly family, living a righteous life yourself, your work is going to be tested, and if it abides, that's great. And you'll receive a reward for that. But your work may get burned up when it's tested. Your work may, what you were working with was not gold, silver, and precious stone. What you were working with instead was wood, hay, and stubble. And what you were working with may get burned up. He says you're going to be saved. It's not like you'll be lost because the people you were working with were unfaithful. It's not like you were going to be lost because your converts, the people you converted, were faithful. He says you'll be saved, but you'll feel a sense of loss. You will suffer loss when that test comes to your work and your work does not endure the test. So I think Paul was talking about exactly what this lesson is about tonight, that it is a test of our faith when some of the people that we've tried to influence end up not making it. They didn't remain faithful. And there's a real sense of loss when that happens. But we got to keep trying.
Just like the parable of the sower, the same message goes out, but different results depending on the individuals so in this life there could be joys and there could be a lot of heartache depending on who you teach and who you influence.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Any comments? We're out of time. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you all. Lord willing, next week, this is kind of interesting. A test of our faith, boredom and weariness. What about that? Lord willing, we'll take that up next week.